Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the what, why, and how of nature-friendly landscaping. This is part of our Landscapes That Last webinar series brought to you from North Carolina Sea Grant and the Coastal Landscapes Initiative. My name is Gloria Putnam. I help to coordinate the initiative on behalf of NC Sea Grant, and I'm based here at NC State University. The major focus of the CLI is to bring topical experts together to create helpful resources that are tailored specifically to coastal North Carolina with the intent of fostering the adoption of practices to support healthy landscapes. With the help of all of our partners, we do hope to continue our monthly webinars on the third Thursday of the month through 2026. We have a recording of our last webinar, local policies for native plants, that's available on our site. And we will be recording today's webinar with everyone that is posted. That's going to be posted online in a few weeks and will be shared with everyone that registered. Our next webinar is going to be on February the 19th. We're going to be looking at invasive plant control strategies and techniques. And our main speaker we're excited about is Robbie Davis from Native Plant Matters. Registration for that event is open, and I'll put it into the chat a little later on. So our main speaker today is Rachel Veal. She is the conservation horticulturist at the North Carolina Aquarium on Roanoke Island. Rachel has been an important and significant contributor to the Coastal Landscapes Initiative since we got started in 2017. I always learn something when I speak with Rachel, casually or in a meeting. She today is going to provide some very solid introduction to the topic of nature-friendly landscaping, and it'll be great for folks that are just getting into this, and it'll be a wonderful refresher and an educational tool for folks that already are familiar with some of the concepts. The intent is for what Rachel shares today and some of the information that I'm going to share to set the stage for our future webinars. We can always refer back to this incredible, fundamental information. Along with Rachel, we have some of our other long-term CLI partners with us today to help field some questions during the Q&A session and along the way. They are all part of the webinar series creation team. So we have Carol Peoples. She is the founder and the co-chair of the North Carolina Native Plant Society Central Coastal Plain. She's down in Emerald Isle. We also have Emily Morrison, who is a horticulture extension agent with the Onslow County Cooperative Extension. We have Amy Mead, who is the director of the Cooperative Extension in New Hanover County. And we have Kathy Mitchell, who has a consulting firm, Coastal Roots Garden Design. Lastly, my colleague here at Sea Grant, Frank Lopez, our extension director, is going to be helping to coordinate the question and answer session that's going to start at the 1 o'clock hour. So we do have the function, the chat function that's available for your use today, but we're asking that you please put the Q&A, put any of your questions into the Q&A box. That's what we're going to be trying to primarily monitor. And it will also allow us to easily answer some of your questions as we go along in the event that there are a flood of questions. Before I hand this over to Rachel, I do want to share some information that I pulled together about the big picture view of coastal North Carolina populations and environmental conditions. And I'm going to do that. I think it's 6 slides. So first of all, this map shows the 20 coastal counties that are included in our state's Coastal Area Management Act. That's the legislation that basically guides how we manage our coastal resources and our coastal development in specific areas. So this area also is generally considered to be the program area for North Carolina Sea Grant. And the counties are divided in 3 regions in this map: the Northeast, the Central, and the Southeast. This map now shows the human population in the 20 coastal counties with the legend that's up on the far left. If you lived in North Carolina for any length of time, you know that the state and the coast have grown and are continuing to grow. In 2024, our coastal population in these Gamma counties was 1.1 million. On the darker the blue colored and this on this map, the higher the population. So down in the southeast part of the state, some counties are up to 240,000 people per county. Also, if you know the coast, it's no surprise to you that most of our population is located in the southeast part of the state. From 1990 to 1924, two of the fastest growing counties in the state were actually Pender County and Brunswick County. All the other counties also grew since 1990, except for two. Bertie County and Hyde County actually lost some population. Of course, with increased population comes increased development. That's loss of vegetation, more houses, more roads, more businesses to accommodate our needs. This results in more stormwater runoff, and that runoff carries pollution and impacts our coastal resources. I want to say that there's just a little bit of data. There's very little data about the specific impacts from these changes to our coastal resources, but there is some limited information about the status of some of our resources, and I want to share that with you here. So this is a map from the Department of Environmental Quality 2020 using 2020 information. The colored lines that you see show the major rivers and streams in the state. And if the line is in pink or in red, that means that the state's monitoring data revealed that pollution levels were above a specific established standards needed for that water. In other words, the water body that is considered, it's a water body that's considered to be impaired, not meeting desired water quality conditions. For example, if it's classified as a shellfishing water and monitoring data shows that it has fecal coliform bacteria levels above a certain level or standards, then it is considered impaired for that standard for shellfishing. Some of the other impairments that we have are for mercury and copper, also excessive nutrients, excessive turbidity, and low dissolved oxygen. When we look down into the water at our submerged aquatic vegetation, we know that back in 2006, state partners started monitoring the condition and the presence, really, of submerged aquatic vegetation. And I want to tell you, it's no small task because it's hard to determine what's under the water. But the green and yellow on this map here shows you where submerged aquatic vegetation beds are primarily located. Shallow water, as you might expect. So SAB is very important habitat for many aquatic species, especially some that we like to consume, including crab, scallops, and drum, among many others. So this water is, submerged aquatic vegetation is impacted by pollution directly, but it's also impacted by other things like boating and rising temperatures. But data indicates that there has been a loss in SAB in the state since they started collecting data. For the period between 2006 and 2013, it is actually reported that losses up here in the Albemarle-Pamlico region range between 3 and 10% of the established baseline acreage in 2006. Depending on where you are, it's higher or lower. The central and northern parts of Pamlico had less loss, and down here in Bogue and Back Sounds, it was somewhere around 12%. No area, in terms of data, no area has actually received a gain in SAB. So I've got 2 more slides left. One of these, this one here is information that was compiled by one of our interns down at University of North Carolina, Wilmington. She looked at data from the Natural Heritage Program for the 20 Gamma counties. Specifically, she gathered information. She took existing data on the specific plant and animals, a subset of them, which I will show in just a minute. The ones that are vulnerable or imperiled, basically meaning that their future existence or presence in the state are in jeopardy. What we see here is the total number of plants and animals that are considered vulnerable and imperiled by the specific regions. The highest number is in the southeast. I don't think that that's a lot of surprise in terms of being somewhat correlated to the amount of development. Rachel also pointed out to me how this is the southeast is really a biological diversity hotspot, and so the more diversity you have, the more species that are going to be number of species that can be impacted. Here we have a bar graph that details the groups that I just was speaking about. It corresponds directly to the map that I just showed you in the regions. We have the Northeast, Central, and Southeast according to color: yellow, orange, or orange. Take a second to let you look at this. So we have vascular plants, birds, butterflies, moths, dragonflies, amphibians, and mammals. So I really just want to bring your attention to the vascular plants based on what we're talking about today. And that is that the Northeast and Central area had 320 and 340, has 320 and 344 species that are imperiled. Well, some of these might be overlapping. It's not like there's 320 individual species in the Northeast and 344 in the Central. But in the Southeast part of the state, there are 750. So I share this information not to depress you, but to help you understand that the actions that you do on your own property really do connect to a larger ecosystem in our state. And what we do actually on our own property makes a difference. So what I want to do now is pass it over to Rachel. And what she's going to do is help further solidify the connections between these relationships.
So, start off, I'd like to talk a little about these three pictures, which I chose both because they're pretty and for the ideas they convey. When I first became interested in plants as a teenager, I had no consideration for where plants came from, but was a pure plant collector, delighted by novelty and beauty, as well as the joy of making things grow. As I've made my way through my degree program in the late 90s, this started to change when I took a job at the State Botanical Garden and became aware of the diversity of native flora not well represented in the horticulture industry. One of my last classes was a landscape architecture class on ecosystems of the Southeast, taught by Daryl Morrison. He wanted us to have an awareness of sense of place, to draw inspiration from our local ecosystems to inform our landscaping choices. He also taught us to appreciate a plant for its own merits and not be influenced by the prevailing attitude in the horticulture industry of, if it occurs naturally and I didn't plant it, it has no value. The picture on the far left, taken in a ditch in Wanchese, here in the Outer Banks, illustrates the inspiration that can be found just by paying attention to the world around you with fresh eyes. The next picture illustrates the stunning red-spotted purple butterfly and its dependence on black cherry as she looks for a place to lay her eggs. As I've learned more about the relationships between native wildlife and native plants, my appreciation of them has inspired me to design landscapes that are purposeful and aesthetically pleasing, as seen in the native plant garden on the right. Understanding the impacts we can have, both negatively and positively, through our landscaping decisions has pushed me to want to share the knowledge I've gained over the years and to see others benefit from implementing these changes in their outdoor spaces. We've designed this presentation to answer the questions we hear most often regarding sustainable gardening. What are the issues with conventional landscaping practices, and what are practical steps we can take to make our yards more wildlife friendly and support the human uses and expectations for these spaces? Or in other words, the what, why, and how of nature-friendly landscaping. Our goal is to bridge the gap between basic science and practical application, avoiding both oversimplification and, hopefully, information overload. While we can't cover everything in a single session, I want to leave you with the confidence and resources, like those from Coastal Landscapes Initiative, to start making a positive impact in your own outdoor space. For the purposes of this presentation, we'll be using the term nature-friendly landscaping. But know that you may also see this way of landscaping referred to as eco-friendly, wildlife gardening, or sustainable gardening. Either way, the basic principles are the same and can be broken down into two basic tenets. One is making plant choices that support the most wildlife, especially invertebrates, and the other is making sustainable choices in how we design and maintain our yards and managed spaces. A working definition that I like is creating aesthetically pleasing landscapes that take into consideration wildlife value and prioritize conservation of natural resources, both locally and globally. Also, for brevity's sake, I'll continue to refer to nature-friendly landscaping, but know that this is shorthand for any type of gardening you do in your managed outdoor spaces. In order to understand what's different about a nature-friendly approach, let's first look at some basic principles that apply to any type of landscaping. Despite what you often hear about gardens that rely on native plants, the style of a garden really depends more on the design and plant choices. Both conventional and nature-friendly gardens aim to be aesthetically pleasing to the owner and can be either formal or naturalistic. I often hear from folks who lament they can't have a nature-friendly garden because the neighbors will complain, but I truly believe this is a false dichotomy and that it's entirely possible to have a nature-friendly yard or garden without turning your yard into a wild meadow or compromising aesthetic value. If this is an issue you've been having, design will be covered more in an upcoming webinar, so stay tuned. Any type of landscaping requires decisions about plant choices, design, and maintenance, and it's how those choices are made that determine the nature friendliness of the space. So let's look at the differences in currently accepted conventional practices versus their nature-friendly alternatives in more detail, starting with plant choices. With conventional gardening, wildlife consideration is not the main focus of plant choice, which is not to say the plants chosen never have wildlife value. They may or they may not, depending on the plant. It's just not a main selection criteria. For instance, this ginkgo, though beautiful, acts more like a statue in your yard. It may provide some bird nesting habitat, but it's not supporting any butterflies or other invertebrates. Nature-friendly gardening always considers the wildlife value of plants and prioritizes the use of keystone natives, which we'll talk about shortly. This isn't to say that every plant in your yard must have the highest wildlife value possible, but that you can start to have an awareness of why you're choosing a plant beyond just the way it looks. Other considerations, that is, beyond wildlife value, are the environmental conditions you can provide. In conventional gardening, there's a mindset that if I want a certain plant, I'm going to make it work, even if that means excessive irrigation, synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, or covering plants with plastic, as in this case, where the plants chosen as a main component of the landscape are grown outside of their hardiness zone to achieve a tropical look. With nature-friendly gardening, there's a consideration of these environmental conditions to inform plant choices and minimize the inputs needed. Many of you have likely heard the term right plant, right place, which summarizes this approach to plant placement in your landscape. Our last plant consideration involves invasive plants. The use of invasive plants is considered acceptable in conventional landscaping practices. This isn't to say they're necessarily prioritized, just that if they're available, there's no effort to avoid them. This can be seen in the installation of Elaeagnus shrubs as screening in most of the new housing developments in my county. In contrast, a basic tenet of nature-friendly gardening is do no harm, which means not introducing plants that could cause damage to local ecosystems when they escape or spread from your yard. In this example, an evergreen screen is still desired, but the owners has relied on native wax myrtles and even oak trees to achieve the same screening effect. The plant choices and design decisions that are made initially will have a big impact on the amount of inputs needed to maintain your space. It's common practice in conventional gardening to rely on synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and irrigation. Nature-friendly gardening, as you may have guessed, uses the approach that if too many inputs are needed to keep a plant alive and looking good, it's probably not the right plant for that spot. Fueling this reliance on synthetic chemicals and irrigation is the reliance on lawns in conventional gardening. Turf currently covers 2% of the United States, or 63,000 square miles, roughly the size of the state of New York. Because lawns are the largest user of both synthetic chemicals and irrigation, nature-friendly gardening attempts to be mindful of where lawns are installed. This isn't to say that they aren't a part of nature-friendly landscape, but that they're used where needed, for instance recreational needs, or that turf alternatives are considered. To learn more about how to do this, you can stay tuned for the Shrink Your Lawn webinar coming up later this summer. To wrap up this intro, what we're talking about is a general mindset shift when it comes to managing outdoor spaces more responsibly. Letting ecology inform your decisions instead of aesthetics alone. There's obviously a spectrum of nature friendliness, and what we're advocating for is a more mindful approach to plant choice design and management that considers the impact of our choices both on our yards and the world around us. So, for today's presentation, part 1 will be the why of nature-friendly gardening, an overview of the science behind nature-friendly practices, which can be divided into 2 general categories. How the decisions I make for my yard affect the environment, wildlife, and people beyond the edges of my property, and how they affect the living things that use my property. We'll be comparing the harms of conventional practices with the benefits of nature-friendly. Part 2 will start us on our how-to journey and discuss the choices that can be made to get the benefits covered in Part 1. This will be more of the practical knowledge and skills needed to implement nature-friendly landscaping practices. We'll start off with how to make plant choices, and later this spring, we'll follow up by diving straight into design and maintenance. So this could also be called the Why Do We Care slide, and attempts to summarize the areas that are impacted either positively or negatively by our decisions for our yard. Let's look at the impacts our decisions have on water quality and availability, air quality and carbon dioxide production, and wildlife, both in our yard and beyond. Starting with water. We've already touched on conventional landscaping's reliance on irrigation, so I'll add just a few statistics here. Lawns are the largest irrigated crop in the U.S., more than corn, soybeans, or alfalfa. Nationwide, landscape irrigation is estimated to account for nearly 1/3 of all residential water use, totaling nearly 9 billion gallons per day. As much as 50% of the water used for irrigation is wasted due to evaporation, wind, or runoff caused by inefficient irrigation methods. If too much fresh water is pumped from an aquifer system, then saltwater can migrate landward by a process referred to as saltwater intrusion. Other factors, such as sea level rise, can exacerbate the issue of overpumping. It's not clear what effect this may have on the future quality of the groundwater in all the coastal Carolina communities, but both availability of water and the quality of the water is at risk as the population grows. Continuing with water quality, as Gloria touched on earlier, this is already an issue in our state, but the way our landscaping decisions affect water quality may be less obvious. There are several issues that can be caused or exacerbated by the runoff of pesticides and fertilizers from our yards. Many lawns and gardens are treated with pesticides, which can run off into local waterways, harming aquatic invertebrates, including the larvae of many commercial shellfish, as well as impacting the food of larger fish. Another issue is nutrient pollution caused from fertilizer runoff. We collectively use about 2.4 million metric tons of fertilizer just to maintain our lawns annually in the U.S. Lawns and gardens rarely absorb all of the nutrients from the fertilizers we apply, and synthetic fertilizers tend to have much higher nutrient levels than what a plant can actually use. The excess nitrogen and phosphorus can seep into groundwater or run to storm drains, and eventually into our local waterways. This leads to a variety of problems with unbalanced algal growth and contamination of groundwater supplies. One impact area is areas of low oxygen or dead zones. When overabundant nutrients cause excessive algal growth, these large blooms die and decompose. The algae itself may or may not be harmful to wildlife, but the decomposition of these blooms depletes oxygen from the water and can lead to the death of fish or other wildlife in the area. In addition, algal blooms of this magnitude can also block photosynthesis of seagrass and other submerged aquatic vegetation and clog the gills of fish. Another nutrient pollution issue is the growth of toxic algal blooms. These toxic algae species are encouraged by excess nutrients in the water supply, yet are often indistinguishable from non-harmful algae. Toxic algal blooms can be fatal to humans and animals, including pets, and cause the shellfish in a given area to be toxic as well. Many waterways are closed to seafood harvest each year in the U.S. due to toxic algae. However, it's not just commercial marine life that are affected. Sea turtles, manatees, bottlenose dolphins, right whales, and humpback whales are just some of the marine megafauna that have been killed or negatively impacted by these blooms in U.S. waters. So to wrap up this issue, there are impacts to our water availability and quality besides our lawn and garden inputs. But our goal here is to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. Nature-friendly landscaping aims to both reduce the use of these chemicals and design landscapes in such a way that reduces stormwater runoff and nutrient pollution into local waterways. Moving on to air and atmospheric pollution, which is impacted by our reliance on gas-powered equipment and synthetic fertilizer production. The less need we have for these inputs, the more we can reduce air pollution and carbon dioxide production. The two pictures here illustrate different ways to manage road medians, an area rarely used for human foot traffic, that are great candidates for lawn replacement projects, like the picture on the right from Arlington Cemetery. Areas like this are a great way to both reduce dependence on lawns and create areas for stormwater to collect and water-wildlife friendly plants. Wildlife impacts are seen both in our yards and beyond. We've already discussed the impacts on aquatic habitats. Our next topic, the impact on the wildlife in our yards, is a more visible and direct impact. Conventional practices remove many of the resources that wildlife need or render them useless through application of pesticides. Nature-friendly practices, in addition to protecting resources beyond the reach of our yard, also protect and replace resources that are lost to development. To understand how our decisions affect wildlife, first consider your yard, and then think about what may have been there before your house was there. For the house on the left, it was a maritime forest with live oak trees and an understory of native shrubs like blueberries, serviceberry, and wax myrtle. It would be difficult to replace all those resources once we were living on a piece of land, but our choices can provide more than just a tree that requires irrigation and provides no significant wildlife value. Development comes with some level of habitat destruction. However, wildlife resources that are lost can be replaced while still having an aesthetically pleasing landscape. What do we mean by wildlife resources? When we're talking landscaping, what we're really talking about is providing food in the form of native plants for the insects that in turn support all the other animals. This is one of my favorite topics, definitely more fun to talk about than all the harms, and is the basis for the native plant advocacy movement. So how do pesticide-free native plants provide food for wildlife? Let's dive into this topic a little deeper to see how our plant choices support wildlife and their importance to the ecological functioning of both natural ecosystems and our landscaped areas. When we're talking about providing food for wildlife, what we're mostly talking about is native host plants. We may understand the idea of a host or hostess at a party, but what does this mean when we're referring to plants? Many of you have heard of a host plant. However, to make sure we're all on the same page, let's elaborate, since the rest of the presentation won't make a lot of sense without understanding their role in our landscapes. Many animals that eat plants, or herbivores, aren't picky about what they eat. Most gardeners are familiar with this particular herbivore, the white-tailed deer. This is an example of a generalist. It's hard to find plants that this generalist herbivore won't eat. Many other herbivores, especially insect herbivores, are specialists, meaning they can only eat certain plants. Some are highly specialized and can only eat one species of plant. Others may be able to eat plants from only one family, and others a few families. These herbivores, like the bee, butterflies, and moths seen here, are known as host specialists, and the plants they depend on are referred to as their host plants. For those of you who are new to the host specialist concept, you likely already know at least one host specialist insect. See if you can think of an iconic insect that is migratory and has inspired many a gardener to create a pollinator garden, and feel free to write that in the chat. As a hint, its host plant is a milkweed. And as you may have guessed, the insect in question is the monarch. Other examples of native butterfly host plants in our area are swamp bay, which is used by the Palomede swallowtail, and partridge pea, a host plant for the cloudless sulfur. You'll notice that the adults of all these species are not picky about where they get nectar. Only the caterpillars or baby butterflies are host specialists. I found this can confuse folks because when they see an adult butterfly at their lantana or butterfly bush, it gives the impression that the butterflies don't have a particular affinity for native plants, when in reality, the host plant dependence is just in a stage of their life where it is less noticeable. The caterpillars have hosts, and the adults you see in your garden can drink nectar from almost any flower. Because the caterpillars of host specialist butterflies and moths rely on specific host plants, the mom will only lay her eggs on the host plant for her caterpillar so that it has food to eat as soon as it hatches. Here are the same 3 butterflies as in the last slides, laying eggs or ovipositing on their host plants. And here are their caterpillars after they hatch. It shouldn't be surprising to us that the babies need different food from the adults, since this is also true of human babies versus human adults. But I'll be honest, it wasn't something I was aware of until much later than I should have been. These are just 3 of the 177 species of butterflies recorded in North Carolina, and all have some degree of host specificity. Sadly, in a report released last year based on long-term survey data, butterfly populations in this country have decreased 22% in the last 20 years. So we can do our part to help by providing food not just for the adult butterflies in the form of nectar, but also host plant food for the babies. While we can all appreciate having butterflies in our yard, even more important to our local ecosystems, yet often misunderstood, are the moths. Despite what this imperial moth thinks, it is not able to eat Cheez-Its or Skittles. In fact, this and other charismatic saturnid moths like the Luna moths don't eat or even have mouth parts as adults. Many of our moth species, including the one pictured here, are host specialists. Because the numbers of moth species is so much higher than butterflies, over 3,000 species in North Carolina and over 11,000 in the U.S., they play a much larger role in supporting wildlife farther up the food chain, even though we're often less aware of them than we are of the butterflies. Another important host specialist that we can support with our landscaping choices are native bees. For native host specialist bees, it's the pollen from their host plant that they need to feed their babies, and only that pollen will do. In North America, 30% of our 4,000 species of native bees are host specialists. That is 1,200 species, and the percentages are the same for North Carolina. It's important to note that these are all solitary bees, so unlike the European honeybees, they don't have a hive to guard and are even more docile. Some don't even have stingers. I'm adding this sidebar because I've noticed a lot of bee fear recently with visitors to our pollinator gardens, which I think might be the result of confusing the habits of our solitary native bees with those of social honeybees. Social insects, like honeybees or paper wasps, have a collective goal to protect their hive or nest when they feel threatened, whereas solitary bees do not have this incentive. If a solitary bee is killed, no one feeds her young and the babies will die, so the adults will avoid situations that seem threatening and should not be considered a hazard. As is probably apparent, the animals we're referring to here are mostly insects and are often overlooked when it comes to making gardening decisions. However, in reality, they should be the focus of plant and maintenance choices when we're trying to garden sustainably. This is because they are the crucial link that transfers the energy from the sun to the organisms higher up the food web. So if the plants available to these insects aren't something that the insect can eat, it will starve and will therefore not be able to transfer the energy from the plant. This is where host plants fit in. 90% of the insects that eat plants can develop and reproduce only on the plants with which they share an evolutionary history, their host plants. Or, in other words, most insects are host specialists. The takeaway message being that if we remove the beautyberry pictured here, that's the host plant of this particular species of sphinx moth caterpillar, it won't survive, nor will any of its other host insects. And that the same is true of most of our native insects, since most depend on particular native plants. If we remove this link, the rest of the web collapses. So let's journey a little farther up the food web and take a look at songbirds. I'm mentioning this because it's another misunderstanding that I often come across. Seeing birds at our feeders or eating fruits from various native and non-native plant species, it could seem like our plant choices aren't that important to birds. While it's true that many adult birds eat both berries and seeds, what we're often not seeing is what the birds don't want us to see, and that is nesting season. An adult bird, like this mockingbird on the left, might be just as happy with the berries from any non-toxic fruit-producing plant, though this one does happen to be the native beautyberry. However, when it comes to nesting season, it will expend most of its energy looking for insects, mostly caterpillars. In fact, 96% of terrestrial birds rely on caterpillars to raise their young. Baby birds cannot eat seeds or nuts and rely on both the protein and the water of an insect for sustenance and to stave off dehydration, since they can't travel to find water. A chickadee baby may consume between 6,000 and 8,000 caterpillars before they fled from the nest, and most of the adult foraging happens within a 150-foot radius of the nest. Without host plants nearby to support that many insects, the likelihood of survival decreases, and the adults have to travel farther from the nest, leaving it unguarded for longer periods of time. It should also be noted that both the caterpillars and foraging birds usually go unnoticed by the casual observer. The caterpillars because they're so small, and the birds because they're trying to be secretive. We can conclude this section on wildlife resources by reiterating that plants native to a particular area host the most invertebrates, and host specialists are dependent on native plants to survive. While almost any plant can provide shelter, nesting space, fruit, and nectar, only native host plants also provide food for baby butterflies, moths, bees, and birds. So a big part of making nature-friendly plant choices is choosing pesticide-free plant species that provide the most wildlife value to be the foundation of your yard. In other words, why only check one of the boxes when you can check them all? Obviously, no one yard can do it all. But looking at your yard as part of a larger picture and providing the stepping stones to create a continuum of habitat in your neighborhood can make a big difference. You can choose to provide both beauty and resources, like the top yard has done by incorporating native hosts and nectar plants, or you can choose aesthetics only and choose a plant that provides only nectar and potentially some nesting habitat. This leads us to what is probably the question I'm asked the most. How do I choose the right plants for my yard? For part 2, we'll try to think about moving away from the default settings to making more sustainable plant choices. Hopefully this is practical advice that you can take with you the next time you're plant shopping, designing, or modifying your yard. The how-to of plant choice involves criteria for selecting native plants, what plants to avoid, and how to consider the environmental conditions of the space you're landscaping before you select your plants. The design and maintenance aspects of using these plants will be covered later this year. Likely many in attendance already knew that native plants are the backbone of a nature-friendly landscape. But how to know which ones to choose? So much of this depends on your yard and growing conditions, whether you're here on the Carolina coast or elsewhere in the country. But a few basic concepts can help you look over your choices to make the best decisions possible. These are understanding your keystone plants, considering diversity, both species and seasonal, and understanding cultivars. Because 90% of our nation's caterpillars rely on 14% of plant species, including these species, known as keystone plants, is an important part of nature-friendly gardening. Your keystone plants will vary somewhat depending on your region, but will be the plants that host the most invertebrates, both specialists and generalists. I'm not sure if there are any Pennsylvania transplants watching, but like the keystone of an arch, a keystone organism supports the rest of the ecosystem. It's crucial to its functioning. Since this is a presentation for the coast of North Carolina, this will be the focus area for our keystone discussion. But know that lots of these plant genera are keystones all along the eastern seaboard, with regional differences in what species is native to a particular area. Lists of these plants can be found online, whatever your region may be, and links are noted in your handout. The top keystone plants for coastal North Carolina are native oaks, cherries, willows, and plants in the aster family. Note that many of these plants have non-native relatives, so another question that folks might have is, can I substitute a non-native in the same genus and get the same results for wildlife? Research continues on this topic, but so far the results have been that while non-native species from the same genera or family may still host invertebrates, the numbers are on average 68% less than their native counterparts. There are over 32 species of oaks in North Carolina, and they can be found in nearly every habitat type in the state. This is good news because oaks support more caterpillars, both host-specific and generalist, than any other plant that's been studied. This makes oaks crucial to nesting birds. They also provide shelter for all sorts of wildlife and food for birds, mammals, and insects in the form of acorns. Here are just a few of the animals supported by oak trees here on the coast, including one of my favorites, a moth that mimics a wasp to scare away predators. It would be impossible to cover all of the oak trees native to coastal North Carolina, so I'm going to highlight just a few. Southern live oak is evergreen and adaptable to soil conditions on the coast. It's also salt tolerant and wind resistant. It's also my state tree from Georgia, so it's a particular favorite of mine. Swamp chestnut oak is a deciduous oak found in our maritime forests. It's great for low-lying coastal areas, as the name implies. Southern red oak is a deciduous oak that's a great choice for fall color. This is more of an upland species and is tolerant of dry conditions. The next genus is Prunus, which includes the cherries. Native cherry flowers are often overlooked source of early season nectar and pollen. They also host 340 species of butterfly and moth caterpillar, including several of our charismatic species like the eastern tiger swallowtail, North Carolina state insect, and the red-spotted purple, one of our most striking butterflies. As a side note, the red-spotted purples rarely consume nectar as adults, preferring poop, sap, and rotting fruit. So the only way to attract these to your garden is to have their host plants. Cherries also provide fruit in the summer for newly fledged songbirds. Two great cherry species for coastal North Carolina are the deciduous black cherry, seen in the top pictures, and the evergreen Carolina cherry laurel. Both of these plants often get a bad rap, I think undeservedly so. The real issue with these plants is our trying to make them into something they aren't, or in other words, user error. I often hear black cherries referred to as trash trees, but I believe, like many malign creatures, it's just misunderstood. Black cherries are a great nurse tree that can be planted alongside more longer-lived trees like live oaks. They'll eventually be overtaken by the oak as the cherry ages out, but will provide protection for the slower-growing but longer-lived tree when it's in its more delicate sapling stage. Black cherries leaf out very early in the spring, and the pink sepals on the leaves are as attractive as the flowers and a welcome bit of color in the March landscape. Black cherry blooms after the leaves unfurl, so they may not be as obvious as other spring bloomers, but are just as important to spring emerging bees. Its affinity for attracting eastern tent caterpillar, a rather messy caterpillar that's only here for a few weeks every spring and does not do permanent harm to the tree, is especially important to the arrival of nesting yellow-billed cuckoos. Carolina cherry laurel, seen in the bottom pictures, is a great evergreen hedge tree. Its suckering habitat is not a great fit for some areas, but perfect for areas where a dense screen is desired. It provides the same flowers and fruits as black cherry, so supports wildlife beyond just its role as a host plant. It's also tolerant of low-lying areas and areas with high water tables. Cultivars are available if height control is needed, and it can be trained as a hedge, screen, or specimen tree. When we think about willows, we often think about the non-native weeping willow. But North Carolina has several species of native willows, including the aptly named Carolina willow and the black willow, which are both frequently found in wetland areas. Despite their affinity for growing in wet areas such as stream and pond edges, they are adaptable to areas with high water tables and can even grow in dry soil with reduced vigor, which is often welcome with these fast-growing plants. One of their best uses is for stormwater ponds, to slow down the flow of water and for soil stabilization. They're very tolerant of low nutrient soils. Willows are a very important early season nectar source, blooming as early as March, and host over 285 species of butterfly and moth caterpillar, with 14 species of specialist bees. They are host to the red-spotted purple also, and viceroy butterflies, and are always a great place to look for migrating warblers like this parula because of the amount of insect biomass they provide. Adding flowering perennials to our yards is one of the most exciting parts of gardening. The aster family is considered to have the highest wildlife value and offers gardeners a wide selection of plants to choose from. Plants in this family can be recognized by their shape, a central disc of flowers surrounded by petals, a classic flower shape that most children would recognize. Well-known flowers in this family include the blanket flower, known locally here as Joe Bell flowers, purple cone flowers, and of course, asters. Some aster family species host over 100 species of butterfly and moth caterpillars, including the pearl crescent butterfly, seen in this picture laying eggs on an aromatic aster leaf. And asters also host more specialist bees than any other plant family. Of course, in nature, there's always exceptions to the rule, And that's no different for the 35,000 species of aster family species worldwide. As you can see from this display of aster diversity, some asters have such reduced petals that the classic sunflower shape is less obvious. However, this doesn't make them any less valuable to wildlife. One example is goldenrods, or solidagos, seen here outlined in green. They are one of the most wildlife-friendly perennials, hosting many species of caterpillars, 42 species of specialist bees, and are an important fall nectar source for monarchs migrating south in the fall, though they are often wrongly blamed for causing allergies. The fall allergies most often caused by their cousin, the ragweed, a plant that's wind-pollinated, so not visited by insect pollinators, and nondescript enough to be overlooked by humans, even though it generally blooms at the same time as the fall goldenrods. There are many, many species of goldenrod to choose from, and some might be too aggressive for smaller yards. But not to fear. If you're worried about them taking over your perennial border, you have many more well-behaved species to choose from. You can think about your top keystone species as the backbone of your landscaping. To round out your garden, you want to add diversity so that you're supporting a wide range of wildlife. Here are just a few shrub species native to North Carolina, but there are hundreds of shrubs to choose from. Shrubs are often overlooked as important pollinator plants, but many provide both nectar and host plant benefits. On the left is the blueberry family, Ericaceae. Blueberry plants are usually found in acidic soil environments, and there are many species to choose from in the North Carolina coastal plain in both upland and wetland habitats. They host 14 species of specialist bees, including the southern blueberry bee, pictured bottom left on a rabbit-eye blueberry flower. Moving to the right side of the screen, we've probably all seen birds like waxwings on our holly plants, but hollies offer more than just berries for birds. Though their delicate flowers are often overlooked, they provide pollen and nectar for early emerging pollinators. They are also host plant for both the Henry's elfin and holly azure butterfly. Like the blueberries, they grow well in acidic soils, and there's a holly for every habitat. Most native species, except for American holly, do not have the prickly leaves that make some hollies undesirable for high traffic areas. When considering perennial diversity, it can also be helpful to think in terms of plant families. One doesn't have to be a botanist to do this. This information is readily available on the web, and the resources are noted in your handout. Here are just a few families with high wildlife value: the carrot, mint, and pea families. All act as butterfly and moth host plants, as well as nectar plants for adult pollinators. Some also support specialist bees. There are many native species from all three of these plant families to choose from, so you can find one to suit your growing condition and aesthetics. In coastal North Carolina, the insects are on the move from March to early November, so aim to have nectar and host plant resources available during the entire growing season. There are almost 3,000 species of plants native to North Carolina, so you'll have plenty to choose from. Pictured here is the same garden throughout the growing season. Plants successionally replace the space of plants that are finished blooming. Asters are available in all seasons, and plants from other families are also available. Cultivars, short for cultivated varieties, are human-selected or bred plants that have specific characteristics, allowing consumers to have a better idea of what they're getting, but decreasing genetic diversity in the selection of available plants. Whether or not to incorporate cultivars is a nuanced issue, and I find it best to ask myself the following questions. The first being, do I have a reason to choose a cultivar over a straight species? There are often good reasons. For instance, the cultivar of aromatic aster chosen here was selected for height control because it was planted in a very windy spot. Another question is whether the cultivar still has its wildlife benefits. For instance, has the color or flower structure been altered so much that it has no value to wildlife? Red leaves don't provide resources for caterpillars, and pom-pom blooms block access to pollen and nectar. The same philosophy applies to adding natives, like the yellow mums on the right. Non-natives will rarely have the same wildlife value as a native, but you can ask the following questions if there are some you'd like to add. One is, do I have a reason to choose this non-native over a native plant? The answer could very well be yes. I can think of many good reasons, but just be aware you could be taking up space for a plant that could offer more. The other is this non-native plant invasive versus being just an introduced species? If so, the answer is always no. The last question, for both cultivars and non-natives, is it appropriate for my purposes? For instance, if you're working on a restoration project, as seen on the left, a cultivar or non-native is unlikely to be appropriate, whereas in a garden, as seen on the right, you may have good reasons to incorporate cultivars or even non-natives. As we already touched on, another consideration when you're deciding whether to choose a non-native plant is whether or not it's invasive in a given area. As my grandma was fond of saying, pretty is as pretty does, and these plants have the potential to negatively impact our ecosystems regardless of any wildlife value that they may have. The North Carolina Invasive Plant Council website has regional lists of plants that are invasive to a given area of the state, so it's a great resource. I personally try to steer clear of planting any species invasive to any part of the Southeast for fear of encouraging its use by visitors to my area. There's also a danger in the introduction of new plants whose invasive tendencies aren't yet known. No one wants to be responsible for the next kudzu or Phragmites introduction. However, an easy rule of thumb to follow is to avoid those on the list, and if you're unsure, then don't plant, especially without a compelling reason. If you'd like to learn more about this topic, there are free resources, including handouts and a webinar on the CLI website, and you can also sign up for our February webinar on invasive plants that Gloria mentioned earlier. In addition to knowing the location of your building and power lines, understanding your environmental conditions is crucial to making sustainable planting decisions and allowing you to reduce reliance on fertilizers and pesticides to keep your plants healthy. Plants survive in their native habitats without us, so looking to these habitats can help us figure out where a plant wants to be. Coastal North Carolina is comprised of many habitat types: maritime forests, dunes, and brackish wetlands, just to name a few. The plants that grow in one may or may not grow in another, even if in close proximity. Ask yourself, what is your habitat or ecosystem? What are the environmental conditions you can offer a plant? Can my yard support a plant, whether native or not, with the conditions I have on offer? To illustrate this, we'll look at seashore mallow, a wetland plant that is not adaptable to dry soils, as you can see by looking at the habitats where it grows naturally. This is a wonderful plant if you have a soundside property or wetland garden, but not a good choice for an upland sandy yard here on the coast. However, there's no need to be disheartened. For most plant genera, you can find a species that will do well in your yard. For example, milkweeds. There are 16 species native to North Carolina, and most are very particular about where they grow. Sometimes just the name will give you clues about where it wants to be. Swamp milkweed, though often seen for sale, only grows in consistently wet environments here on the coast. Orange milkweed is more adaptable, drought-tolerant choice, and a good size for most gardens. Clasping milkweed is rarely seen for sale, but locally native to forest edges. This patch, on the way to the airport in Manio, has sadly been extirpated since I took this picture, but if it occurs naturally in your woodland garden, it would be a great plant to preserve. As mentioned in the beginning, just because a plant occurs naturally in your yard doesn't mean it has no value. Depending on where you live, there are services available to help you figure out what you already have, and if not, they're great phone apps that are pretty accurate as well. Some plants are hard to source from nurseries, so knowing what you have can save you lots of time, effort, and money. These are all examples of plants that occurred in empty lots, ditches, woodland edges, and even front yards within walking distance of my house, and have since been cleared somewhat needlessly. One example is the removal of grass leaf asters, seen in the bottom middle picture, a drought-tolerant, low-maintenance native ground cover naturally occurring in many dry sandy yards here in the Outer Banks, to be replaced by turf grass. The turf never ends up looking as good and inevitably requires more upkeep and input. However, any of these plants would be a boon to your yard, and if a plant is already there naturally, likely it wants to be there, is established, and has the environmental conditions it needs. No matter what space you have, your decisions and actions can make a difference. No yard exists in a bubble, and we're all surrounded by neighboring yards, wild spaces, and waterways, so each of us has an opportunity to do good. Even if you're a renter or apartment dweller, you can add wildlife-friendly planters to your space, and there are free resources, both print and webinar, at the CLI website to help you with your plant selection. Making the best plant decisions is one step you can take to creating more nature-friendly spaces. How you design and maintain those spaces, which will be addressed later this year, will also affect the environmental sustainability of your landscape. So in closing, I want to add that since I can now compare the type of gardening that I once did to my current approach, I can honestly say that it is infinitely more fun and interesting to take a nature-friendly approach. Responsibility is a big part of it. When you know better, you can do better. But the joy of watching the seasons unfold, both in plant and animal life, is such an adventure. Beyond that, the opportunity to watch others, both kids and adults, discover all the hidden wildlife in the resources we provided is a great joy. So with that, we'll move on to the question and answer portion of the presentation. But first, I'm going to change slides real quick so that you can all have a chance to see where upcoming native plant sales may be in your area. And also to thank everyone who helped me so much in pulling all this information together, and especially to Gloria, who has the thankless task of dealing with the technology. I would also like to thank everyone in our virtual audience for taking the time to attend and hope you found this information helpful. Our contact information is here should you have any follow-up questions you don't feel were addressed or may not be in the other webinars mentioned. Lastly, Gloria wants me to ask everyone to look for the survey in the chat, as we would appreciate your feedback. And with that, I'll turn it over to Frank, who has been monitoring our questions. I'll leave this up for just another minute so you can see them.
Yeah, there was a question for these type of resources, so I think it's a good idea. But I'll do this in radio for a moment. I'll start with a question to you, Rachel, related to development at different scales. That can be at a community scale, at a parcel scale, and then also within. I'm going to combine a couple of the questions in a homeowners association scale. Is there, what's the best option that we have for getting some of these on the landscape in those various places? Communities, homeowner associations, and parcels.
Trying to think of an easy way to answer that, and other people probably want to weigh in too. I know HOAs have been a big topic of ours for the whole time we've been together. As they do tend to have rules sometimes that make it trickier than when you don't live in an HOA. I don't know that there is a best answer for that. I think a lot of it depends on where you live, but really a multi-pronged approach would probably be what I would suggest, working with whatever community groups you feel like you're going to have the most traction with. I mean, often your local government is a good place to start. I know Carol's had a lot of luck with that down in Emerald Isle. Reach out to your extension service and see what suggestions they have for your every area, just because every county is so different. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I'd be happy to.
Okay.
I think such a big component of making change is education. And I know through the Native Plant Society, we have people ready and willing to go to HOA boards and do presentations, or for the community, because planting that seed is where you get the people who are in these neighborhoods that have HOAs to start asking for something different. And I think that's a really good place to start.
I would add too that the December webinar that the CLI group you all provided was on policies for native plants, local policies. And so I believe in the chat, Gloria's put the link to that webinar, so you can look at that and maybe get a little more information on that topic. Here's a question that Amy wanted to answer for us all. And so who are the best people to speak to in order to get these messages spread? It can be hard to know where to start. Is it at the town or city council level? Is it state legislators, neighbors, in that vein? Thank you, Amy.
I definitely meant for all of us to answer that question, because that's we've all said, it's different in every town. I know that Carol has made a significant difference in her own town of Emerald Isle by working with that town. And so, finding those people who are interested. So, town landscape managers, so that you can really start to change people's minds. So we, an extension, start with education. But then the next step is for you people who live in your communities to make those contacts with your town, your city officials. I know there was a question also about HOAs. How do we change HOA guidelines as well? And that means joining your HOA boards, joining those landscape committees to start to turn those bylaws and create those change within your own communities. So we'll provide the education for you. All of us provide education. So if you need us to come to your towns and provide these kinds of education for your town officials, for your people in your communities, we can do that. And then the next step is to start change some of those regulations. Carol, do you want to talk about Emerald Isle and some of your work there?
I'd be happy to. And I believe we do have some Emerald Isle people watching today, including Commissioner Brownlow, and I believe Mayor Lagos was going to be joining us. It has been, a few years process, but I think developing relationships with people who are in positions to make change is very important. Being able, go to your town meetings. Almost every town has a public comment period that's like 3 minutes long, and you can speak about whatever you'd like to speak about. You can ask them to host an educational forum. Any of our agencies, as Amy mentioned, would be happy to help with that. And then I think just keep plugging along, and you might want to reach out to people within your community who are like-minded, because many voices are much more effective than one. But I'm very pleased. The leadership in Emerald Isle has been very willing to listen and learn about native plants, and I find them to be more and more supportive and accepting. So I think it's a real pleasure when we can work together on these projects.
Yeah, I would, if I could just jump in quickly and say that everything that's been said makes so much sense to get involved locally, educate your officials, and also we have actually had, there's also some effectiveness running for local office, serving on some of these boards, whatever that you may have a planning board, even if you don't want to run for a full-time sort of semi-full-time or full-time job as an elected official, being on some of the summer review boards is effective. And of course, educate yourself. Excuse me, the more you know, the more you can relay it to others.
May I add one thing? We are just now forming an advocacy committee through the Native Plant Society, and there will be a page on our website that will provide resources for people to give them the support that they need to become better advocates in their own communities. So be looking for that.
So another question. So looking for case examples. So, like Mr. Brownlow has asked, are there other local governments that have native landscape projects on public areas? What worked well? What challenges did they encounter? And in that and anything you come up with related to financing a project like that would be well taken as well.
I'm just going to jump in quickly. Sorry, Rachel, and just say that those are all good questions. We do have a map on our CLI webpage that identifies publicly accessible sites with native plants. That'll be up for a little bit longer before the software company has decided to quit using that, and we're not going to have that updated for much longer. But that's there now. And Matt, the kind of information that Mr. Brownlow is asking for, we take a little bit of time to sort of pull together and provide. But I think that that's something for us to kind of keep in mind for future webinars and materials.
So another aspect of a question here related to development and the effect on wildlife. Obviously when something is a new project, it often goes in, it paves and clears trees, etc. And then you're basically starting from scratch. So are there ways to think about, fixing that from the beginning?
I'll start that one. I mean, I think a lot of it depends on, if you have a piece of land and you're making your own decisions, then yes, I would say 100%. Like, you have potentially the choice to go through and be like, okay, this is, I want to save some of these things. I think what's been happening, at least in Dare County, a lot more is that, it's more developers are coming in and creating a whole street. So, and then the homeowner comes in. So it's not the person who's going to live in the house doesn't really come in until after all the landscaping decisions have been made. That's not always the case though. And I think, yeah, definitely if you're more involved with your builder, preserving things that you have, even if they're small, I've even seen it here on our property. I've been able to, people often don't recognize trees and other plants in their kind of sapling stages. So kind of going through and be like, oh, this is a small plant. It's not, even if I clear stuff around it, it's going to be okay. But, and I've saved several live oaks on the property that people just didn't realize they were live oaks because they were young and now they're like trees. So, I think, yeah, that is, if you can get in on that stage, if you're lucky enough to do that, when it's coming from the other way around, if it's, a developer's like, oh, I bought this street and I'm going to clear it. I think my understanding is it's just much cheaper to kind of get rid of it all and then start new. I mean, I'm not obviously a builder, so but that's my understanding of why that happens. It's just, I mean, it's not malicious. It's just people want to maximize profit. So
And
if anybody
there are communities, including in Rhode Island, that part of our UDO is that builders and developers preserve 35% of the natural area on the site. I will say I don't think that is consistently happening. It still appears that there's significant clearing, and I'm not sure how consistently that's enforced, but it is, it's in our ordinances. What I would love to see is more incentives for people, A, to preserve as much as possible, and then B, to add native plants back to their properties when they're landscaping versus non-natives or non-native invasives. If there was some way a community could provide those plants as they do, I know down in New Hanover County at some of their events at low cost or free trees and shrubs that are supposed to be here, I think that's another way to make an impact.
I'll just wrap that up too, because I've come from Brunswick County where there is really very fast development. So sometimes it's very difficult because the land that is being sold is timberland, and so often what happens is the timber is sold, and so that is within people's rights to sell their timber, but it does mean that the entire site is cleared. Like Rachel said too, a lot of times sites are cleared because of underground utilities, especially when you're building a development site, and you really put in those underground utilities. There is a model from Union County where they do have a county arborist where they have seen some positive changes. And so a lot of times there's planning staff in counties or towns, and they are looking at plans on a piece of paper. When you have an arborist who can go to a site and meet with developers, sometimes there are trade-offs that can be made or encouragement that happens. Like, if you retain this area over here, this natural area, then we can, allow you to have the, sidewalk or whatever you want over here. So, sometimes having those staff people that work with developers and build those relationships with developers can actually create positive change to retain larger trees on the site. But that's an investment that you have to ask your towns or municipalities to make with regards to use of trees on the site. We do see a difference in the city of Wilmington because there is a city arborist And we have, city of Wilmington has a much higher canopy. They also have a tree ordinance in place as well that's been in place for a long time. So we'll do see better retention of trees on properties because of that, both the ordinance and having a city arborist as well.
I'm going to pitch this fastball to you because I know, you've had some conversations a little bit about, shoreline type of vegetation. What kind of products will you be offering or thinking about offering in the future related to aquatic vegetation on bulkheads and things like that?
For me?
Anybody.
Anybody.
Well, Amy can jump in here too. And we have like two different. One product is in the process salt tolerant plants document that we've been plugging away at for a while. That hopefully that will be finished by summer, and we'll hopefully have a webinar also on that, because that's a problem that a lot of people are having as we're seeing higher water levels and saltwater intrusion. There are issues with shoreline plantings. And then the other, there will be some information in there about in the water plantings, if you will, not full-blown marsh restoration, but if you want to enhance wetland that's already, or submerged aquatic vegetation that's already adjacent to your property. My understanding that there are some general guidelines, and there's some information out from a number of different people, but we'd like to think about compiling that and just making a small fact sheet for people to refer to. Amy, anything else?
I was just going to point out North Carolina Coastal Federation and others do a lot of trainings on living shoreline installations. They do a lot of grant work to install those living shorelines. And so that I would definitely direct you to them to coordinate that. They'll come out. There's also, I think NEARS does that work as well. So there's a lot of resources out there on living shorelines. I definitely work in the aquatic vegetation area, but mostly with ponds and waterways.
Great. I see a question here I'm going to answer myself. So there was Gloria had mentioned that there was a map that was created by CLI of some notable sites, and I'm going to put the link into the chat for everyone to see. That's from our CLI web page, which is on the Sea Grant web page, and it has lots of resources, including the map.
Well, I want to also, I had seen a question asking about the resource that Rachel had referred to. It's she had created a great outline for her presentation today, and I shared that earlier in the week that for people that had registered, I think by probably around 1:00 on Tuesday. And so I will send out, when I send out the link to the entire recording, I will include that. I will include the reference sheet that she so kindly created for everybody as well, so that everybody that registered after that point gets it. And while I have the floor, just let me say, I'm sorry about the chat issue. It's functioning now. I'm not sure what happened. We did get that. Figured out.
Comment from one of our attendees. They noted that there are many homeowners that will buy only native plants now. So the message is getting out there. That's the only question. That's all the questions I see in the Q&A right now.
There was one question about what we think about native seed mixes, and I don't know if Rachel can talk about.
Yeah, I just saw. I think it showed up in the chat, and another viewer responded, and I agree. I would definitely avoid them from the big box stores. Someone said, usually the kind of bulk ones are not, I mean, they don't necessarily have anything bad, but they very well may. But there are a lot of resources that you can get native wildflower seed mixes, and those you can get specifically for your area. Trying to think of the most concise way. There's lots of places. I don't want to like go through a long list. I can send some to Gloria. Maybe she can just add that to when she sends out the research. But if you just Google, native plant seed sources Southeast, like there are quite a few that and then you know what you're getting, versus there definitely can be. I've definitely seen seed mixes with some pretty suspect things in them, so I definitely wouldn't get them from a big box store. I'm not sure if that was. I know it's sort of a vague question, so I'm not sure if that's what they mean by the experience. Sometimes also I would say with the wildflower seed mixes, they're usually annuals. So not there's anything wrong with annuals, but if you're looking for like a longer, if you're looking for perennial wildflower seed mix, that's usually not what you're going to find. And usually it's going to be like cornflowers, zinnias, cosmos, things like that. So
I know a lot of them have a good bit of partridge pea in those mixes and those native wildflower mixes, which is a wonderful plant, but you will have a lot of partridge pea, which can be a great thing. But
yeah. And I think also the wildflowers, this is kind of getting more design and maintenance than plants, but I try to think of like those, especially partridge pea or like the shorter, faster growing wildflower seed mixes as a way, like if I'm planting a perennial bed and I have some longer lived perennials that are going to take a while to establish, like putting those around it, like they're, most of them are going to be reseeding, not as much like the partridge pea. It's not like one plant, it's just going to reseed. So over time, if you can have like longer lived perennials that'll take over that space, they'll sort of peter away. And they're so easy, like you can just pull what you don't need. It's not like something that's hard to get rid of. So, yeah.
Yeah, a resource that slipped out of my head. Thanks to Laura Eddy for reminding me. There's a note in the chat there that the Wildlife Resource Commission has a green growth toolbox, and that is a great set of resources related to maintaining wildlife corridors and things like that.
All right.
I think we're caught up.
Yeah. And we are a little bit past our time. Just one final thanks to everybody for participating today on the panel. Thank you so much, Rachel, for all the time you put into preparing your presentation and providing it today. It's wonderful information. We hope that we see everybody else in future webinars. Hopefully we won't have any sound issues at that point, but thank you everybody for being here.